Imagine that you've built an empire from the ground up. Luxury cars, a mansion, and all the success you ever dreamed of. But deep down, you're still empty. One day, a visit to an orphanage, meant to boost your image, turns into a revelation that shatters your world. A little girl looks at you with hauntingly familiar eyes and says, "I know you. You're my father." In that instant, everything changes. The life you've worked so hard for, the life you thought was perfect, comes crashing down. How far would you go to make things right? Would you choose your empire or the family you never knew you had? If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. James Bennett lived a life most people only dreamed of. From the outside, his world was flawless, shiny, immaculate, and filled with luxury. A self-made entrepreneur, James had built his multi-million-dollar empire from the ground up. Luxury cars, a sprawling mansion perched on the edge of the city, and the admiration of his peers were his rewards. His days were spent in high-rise offices making deals, negotiating, and attending meetings, all while his empire expanded. Yet despite all the success, something inside him felt empty. It wasn't the kind of emptiness that comes from a lack of material wealth, but something deeper, harder to place, harder. James had everything, but he still found himself longing for something more. He couldn't figure it out. He had worked tirelessly for years, and now that he had it all, he still couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The faces of those around him blurred into the background of his perfect life. His wife, Olivia, seemed distant. Their conversations mere exchanges of pleasantries rather than the deep connection they once had. Their relationship had been overtaken by his career, and now, even with the wealth he had acquired, he couldn't remember the last time he truly felt like he was with her. Each morning, James would wake up in his spacious penthouse, the city's skyline stretching out before him. The view was breathtaking. He had designed his life to be nothing short of impressive. Yet despite the beauty of the view, his eyes would wander across the room to the stack of papers on his desk, the never-ending emails, and the unrelenting demands of his business. Everything he had worked for, all the success, seemed to come at a cost. The cost of not living, of not truly experiencing life outside the walls of his office and home. It was one evening, after yet another board meeting that stretched late into the night, that James found himself walking through the lobby of his building, lost in thought. The world outside his office felt unfamiliar to him. It was as if he was looking through a window, disconnected from the life outside. His personal world, his family, was no different. Olivia had become more of a roommate than a wife, and he had no idea how to fix it. The work he had put into building his empire had consumed him entirely. As James drove home, the sleek black Bentley's engine hummed smoothly, a reflection of his carefully constructed life. He had everything, but he felt nothing. It wasn't long before he realized that his soul had been drained in the pursuit of wealth. He had traded something precious for something that didn't bring him peace. He arrived home to an empty house. The lights in the living room flickered, and a faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Olivia was already asleep. As usual, James felt the coldness in the air, the absence of connection. He wondered if she still cared, if they had anything left in common. He stood there in the doorway, staring at the empty space that had once been filled with laughter and warmth. The next day, in an attempt to do something good, James decided to visit a local orphanage. He thought it would be the perfect opportunity to make a charitable donation, maybe even take a few photos for his PR campaign. The idea was simple: give back, boost his public image, and go on with his day. It was another task to tick off his list. He wasn't expecting much from it, but the orphanage visit would turn out to be the turning point in his life. He arrived at the orphanage, greeted by the worn-out walls and the humble building that seemed to echo the quiet of forgotten lives. His car's engine rumbled to a stop in front of the building, and James stepped out, adjusting his golden watch, the symbol of his success. The contrast between the opulence of his car and the modesty of the orphanage was stark. He could feel the tension between the two worlds, one that he lived in and one that he barely acknowledged. As he walked inside, he was greeted by Grace Morgan, the kind-hearted director of the orphanage. "Mr. Bennett, it's an honor to have you here," Grace said, her voice warm and welcoming. "The children are excited to meet you." James offered a polite smile, nodding as he followed Grace down the dusty hall. Children peered from behind corners, their faces curious but full of admiration. The air in the orphanage was thick with the smell of old wood and chalk. It was a far cry from the polished boardrooms and executive lounges he was used to. But as he walked further into the building, he couldn't help but feel a sense of discomfort. The walls that separated his world from theirs seemed to be closing in, and the guilt he had been suppressing for years began to creep into his mind. He continued down the hall, his eyes scanning the children. Some whispered his name, others shyly waved. But there was one girl who stood out, a small girl, no more than 8 years old, with disheveled brown hair and striking green eyes. She didn't look at him in awe like the other children. Instead, she stared at him with a look of recognition that unsettled him. He crouched down, to her level, attempting to be friendly, though he couldn't shake the strange feeling in his chest. "Hi," James said, forcing a smile. "What's your name?" The girl's gaze never wavered. "Sophia," she replied softly, her voice almost a whisper. James chuckled nervously, trying to ease the tension. "You know, I've been on TV a lot. Maybe you've seen me there." Sophia didn't flinch or react. Instead, she simply said, "No, I know you from a photo." Those words sent a cold shiver down his spine. "A photo?" he repeated, his voice tinged with confusion. "Yeah, my mom kept it," Sophia said matter-of-factly. The world around James seemed to stop. His heart skipped a beat as the name of the woman from his past flashed through his mind. Elise Thomas, the woman he had loved and left behind. Sophia's words echoed in his ears. The photo, the recognition in her eyes. It all pointed to something he hadn't expected. And in that moment, everything began to change. What James thought was a simple donation, a quick stop in his busy day, was turning into the unraveling of his carefully crafted life. Little did he know, this was just the beginning. James sat frozen in his place as the words from Sophia echoed in his mind. "I know you from a photo." He hadn't expected anything like this. He had come here to make a donation, boost his image, and leave. But now, the young girl in front of him had opened a door to a past he had long buried, one he never thought he'd confront. The look in her eyes was so familiar, so haunting. She wasn't just another child in the orphanage. She was a part of his history, a history he had tried to move on from. "Who was your mom, Sophia?" James managed to ask, his voice shaky. He could feel the tension rising in his chest as his thoughts raced. Who could this girl be? He had left everything behind for success, but was it possible he had left something, someone, behind too? "Sophia Stevens," she said, her voice calm but with a strange sense of certainty. That's her name. The world around James seemed to stop. His knees felt weak, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse. Sophia Stevens. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't heard that name in years, but the memories flooded back in an instant. Sophia Stevens was the woman he had loved, the woman he had abandoned in his pursuit of success, the woman he had promised to marry, the woman who had carried his heart in her hands and he had walked away from her. The realization crashed over him. Sophia was his daughter, the child he had never known existed, and now, standing before him, was the living proof of his past mistakes. The girl had his eyes, the same shade of green that once sparkled with hope and dreams, the same eyes that belonged to Elise. He had turned his back on her, and now he was faced with the consequences. "Where's your mom, Sophia?" James asked, his voice trembling. He wasn't sure if he was ready to hear the answer, but he needed to know. He needed to understand what had happened to her, to them. Sophia's eyes darkened for a moment, her small face becoming sad and distant. "She went to the sky 2 years ago," she said softly. I live here now. James felt as though the ground had been ripped from beneath his feet. Elise was gone. She had passed away, and he hadn't even been there. He hadn't been there for her when she needed him, and now he wasn't there for Sophia either. The guilt and regret flooded over him in waves, drowning him in their weight. I'm sorry, James whispered, more to himself than to Sophia. He wasn't sure what else to say. How could he make up for all the years he had missed? How could he fix what he had broken? Sophia, sensing the change in the air, hesitated for a moment before she spoke again. Do you want to see the photo? She asked, her voice quieter now. James nodded, his throat tight. Sophia led him down the hall to a small room, her small feet pattering against the worn wooden floor. She reached under her pillow, pulling out a small, crinkled photograph. The edges were frayed, and the picture had clearly been well loved, held close through the years. She handed it to James, and as he held the photo in his hands, his heart clenched. It was a picture of him and Elise, taken on the beach during a time when everything had seemed possible. They were smiling, wrapped in each other's arms, the sun setting behind them. It was a moment frozen in time, a moment that James had once cherished but had now pushed far into the recesses of his mind. The photo was a reminder of the love they had shared, of the life they had planned together. And now, that same love had left a scar that he couldn't erase. He looked at Sophia, her green eyes staring up at him with such innocence, such trust, and it hit him even harder. This little girl, this daughter, had been living a life without him. She had grown up without a father, without the love and care he should have given her. And all he had to offer her now was an apology. Sophia's small hands trembled as she looked at him, her expression full of innocence and understanding. I think we have a lot to talk about, she said quietly. James wiped his eyes, forcing a smile. He didn't know what to say, how to explain the flood of emotions he was feeling. How could he apologize for the years he had missed? How could he explain the choices he had made? But he knew that words would never be enough. He had a daughter now, a daughter he had just discovered, and he was determined to make it right. But inside, a storm was brewing. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built over the years, suddenly felt insignificant. His empire, his wealth, his business, none of it mattered now. He had spent his life chasing success, but what good was it if he didn't have the family to share it with? The family he had abandoned in pursuit of something that could never truly fulfill him. As he stood there, lost in his thoughts, Carla, the orphanage director, stepped into the room, her presence gentle yet firm. Mr. Bennett, is everything all right? She asked, concern etched on her face. James looked up, trying to compose himself. Yes, Carla, he said, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. Everything's fine, but I need to speak with you privately. It's about Sophia. As they stepped into Carla's office, James's mind raced. He was torn between the world he had known and the family he had just discovered. He had spent years building his empire, focusing on business deals, on success. But now everything felt so small. The weight of the truth was heavier than any business deal he had ever closed. How could he make up for all the lost years? How could he give Sophia the life she deserved after all this time? Carla sat across from him, watching him with quiet understanding. She had seen this before. Men like James, who had built their lives on ambition and success only to find that the true riches lay in something far simpler, far more meaningful. You don't have to have all the answers right now, Mr. Bennett, Carla said softly. But you do have a chance to be the father you never knew you could be. Don't let that slip away. Her words were like a lifeline, pulling him from the overwhelming tide of regret and guilt that threatened to consume him. James took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know how to be a father, how to make up for the time he had lost. But he knew one thing. He would try. For Sophia. For Elise. For the family he had left behind. The decision wasn't easy, and it wouldn't come without sacrifices. But for the first time in a long while, James felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that he couldn't turn his back on it again. Sophia was his daughter, and he would do whatever it took to be there for her. "I think we have a lot to talk about," James murmured, echoing Sophia's words from earlier. And with that, he made a silent vow to himself. He would rebuild his life not with wealth and power, but with love, redemption, and the family he had just discovered. The next morning, James woke up with a heavy heart. His luxurious penthouse felt foreign to him now. The once comforting view of the city below seemed distant, almost meaningless. He could see the distant skyscrapers, their windows gleaming in the morning light, a symbol of his success. But now, all he could think about was Sophia. Her eyes, the way she had looked at him, the pain in her voice when she mentioned her mother, Elise. Everything he had worked for seemed insignificant in comparison to the new reality he was facing. He was a father now, and he had no idea how to begin making up for the years he had lost. As James got ready for the day, the familiar routine of his morning preparation felt robotic. He picked up his tailored suit, his watch, those little symbols of his success, and realized how much he had neglected the very things that mattered most. He put on his clothes, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as he walked through the rooms of his penthouse. The emptiness of it all seemed to weigh him down. He had everything, and yet he had nothing. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Olivia, his wife. "How's your day looking?" the message read. It was brief, as always. James had learned to communicate with Olivia in the same way he ran his business, with efficiency, no emotion, no connection. He typed a quick reply. "Busy, meetings all day." He didn't know what to say to her. He hadn't been honest with her, and she had begun to notice the growing distance between them. But how could he explain to her that everything had changed? That the foundation of his life had shifted, and now he didn't know how to move forward? As he left the penthouse and made his way to the car, he felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He had made his choice to focus on Sophia, but what did that mean for his marriage? What did it mean for his empire? Could he balance both his new responsibilities and the demands of the life he had built? He wasn't sure, but he knew he couldn't go back to the way things were. Not now, not after seeing Sophia's face, not after learning the truth. When James arrived at the orphanage later that day, he wasn't the polished businessman he used to be. He didn't wear his usual tailored suit or the golden watch that had become a part of his identity. Instead, he wore a simple jacket and jeans, trying to blend in, to shed the layers of his wealth and status, even if just for a moment. He was no longer just a successful entrepreneur. He was a father, and he needed to learn how to be one. As he walked through the halls of the orphanage, he felt out of place. The staff greeted him warmly, but there was an air of uncertainty about him, as if they were unsure of how to treat him. After all, he was a stranger to this world of modesty and simplicity. He wasn't used to this life, this way of living. Everything about it felt unfamiliar, and for the first time in a long while he didn't feel in control. When James entered the playroom, he saw Sophia sitting on the floor surrounded by other children. Her face lit up when she saw him, and she jumped up from the floor, running over to him with a bright smile. James crouched down to her level, his heart swelling with emotion. For the first time in a long while, he felt a connection that went beyond business deals and power. This was real. This was family. "Hi, Sophia," James said gently, his voice filled with warmth he hadn't known he was capable of. "I came back to see you." "I'm glad you came back, Mr. Bennett," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I was hoping you would." James smiled, but the weight of his emotions threatened to break through. He had missed so much of her life. So many years had passed while he was focused on his career, and now he was trying to catch up, trying to make up for everything he had missed. "I think we need to get to know each other better," James said, his voice cracking slightly. The words felt inadequate in the face of everything he had missed. How could he make up for all the years that had passed? "Really?" Sophia asked, her voice full of hope. "Like a real dad and daughter?" James paused, a lump forming in his throat. How could he possibly be a real dad to her after all this time? How could he make up for the years he had lost? He wasn't sure, but he knew he had to try. For her, for Elise, for himself. Yeah, James said softly, his heart breaking as he looked at her. Like a real dad and daughter. Sophia's face lit up and she threw her arms around him in a tight hug. For the first time in his life, James felt something he hadn't felt in years. A sense of purpose, of love, of belonging. He had spent so much of his life chasing success, but in this moment, he realized that success meant nothing if it wasn't shared with the people you loved. As they spent the afternoon together, James felt a peace he hadn't known in a long time. He taught Sophia how to ride a bike, and they laughed together as she wobbled and fell. He listened to her stories about school, about her friends, about her dreams. He saw the way her eyes lit up when she talked about the things she loved, and it filled him with a sense of pride. She was his daughter, and he was going to be there for her. But as the day came to an end, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. His company, his empire, the thing he had worked so hard to build was still there, waiting for him. The pressures of the business world were never far behind, and he knew that he would have to return to that life eventually. But for now he was determined to focus on Sophia, to be the father she deserved. As James drove home that evening, he felt a sense of calm that he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he had made the right choice. For the first time, he had chosen love over success, and it felt like freedom. The phone rang in the car, breaking the silence. James glanced at the screen. It was his assistant, Lisa. "Mr. Bennett, the board wants to meet with you tomorrow. They're concerned about your recent decision to spend so much time with Sophia. They want to discuss the direction of the company." James felt a tightness in his chest. The board was questioning his commitment to the company, and it wasn't the first time. He had always known that the demands of running a business would conflict with his personal life. But now, it felt like the stakes were higher. Sophia had become the center of his world, and he couldn't ignore her for the sake of his company anymore. "Tell them I'll be there," James said, his voice steady. "But I'm not going back to the way things were." As he ended the call, he looked out the window at the city below. The lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of everything he had built. But in his heart, he knew that his true legacy would be the family he had found, the daughter he had rediscovered. He was ready to make it right, no matter the cost. The following morning, James woke up to the sounds of the city that never slept. The hum of traffic, the distant chatter of pedestrians, and the usual urban hustle filled the air. But today, it all felt distant. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by thoughts of Sophia. As he lay in bed, he couldn't help but replay the moments from the previous day over and over again. The laughter they shared, her small hand in his, the way she had looked at him with such innocent trust. It was overwhelming in the best and worst way. He had always prided himself on being in control of his business, his life, his future. But now he found himself questioning everything. He glanced over at Olivia, who was still fast asleep beside him. The silence between them was deafening. Their marriage, once full of passion and shared dreams, had long since been buried beneath the weight of his success. They hadn't spoken much in the past few weeks, their conversations reduced to logistical exchanges. She had noticed the changes, of course. She had seen him disappear into his work, seen the distance growing between them. But how could he explain to her that everything had changed? How could he tell her that after all this time he was finally starting to see what truly mattered? As he got out of bed and began his morning routine, the weight of his responsibilities felt heavier than usual. He had to meet with the board of directors today, an emergency meeting called to discuss his recent focus on Sophia. They wanted answers, clarity, and James knew that his personal life was no longer something that could be hidden behind the curtains of his corporate empire. The world had a way of prying into everything, and now his choices were under scrutiny. After a quick breakfast, James kissed Olivia on the cheek, silently leaving for the orphanage. As he drove, his thoughts were consumed with the meeting ahead. Would the board understand? Could he really step away from everything he had worked so hard to build? He had spent years creating this empire, but the price had been steep. his relationship with Olivia, his work-life balance, and most of all, the time he had missed with his daughter. Now, the very thing he had been running from, his past, his mistakes, was sitting right in front of him, demanding his attention. When James arrived at the orphanage, Sophia was already waiting for him. She stood outside, her small figure barely visible among the other children, but her bright eyes seemed to find him instantly. As he approached her, he felt a sense of warmth in his chest, a connection that was undeniable. She smiled up at him, and for a moment James forgot about everything else. The board, the business, his responsibilities. All that mattered in that moment was Sophia. "Hi, Mr. Bennett," Sophia said, her voice filled with excitement. "I'm so glad you came back." James crouched down to her level, his heart swelling with emotion. "I'm glad to be here, Sophia," he said softly. "I think we need to spend more time together, get to know each other better." "Really?" Sophia asked, her eyes widening. "Like a real dad and daughter?" James felt a lump form in his throat. How could he have missed so much of her life? How could he have ignored this precious child for all these years? He didn't have the answers, but he knew that he couldn't waste any more time. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Like a real dad and daughter, the two of them spent the morning together, playing games with the other children, laughing, and talking. It was a day unlike any other for James. For the first time, he felt like he was truly present, like he was living for something other than his business. Sophia's smile, the way she laughed, the way she looked at him with such hope, it made everything else seem small. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something meaningful. As the afternoon wore on, James knew that the meeting with the board was drawing near. He had to face the reality of what was coming. He had made his decision to focus on Sophia, but he also knew that his business empire wasn't going to just disappear. He had worked too hard for it, sacrificed too much. But was it worth it? What good was all the success if he couldn't have a family to share it with? After saying goodbye to Sophia, James drove to the office, his mind filled with uncertainty. The boardroom was waiting for him. As he entered the room, the familiar faces of his colleagues greeted him with stern expressions. They were already seated, their eyes fixed on him as he walked to the front of the room. James felt the weight of their gazes, the pressure mounting, as he prepared to explain himself. "Mr. Bennett," Ricardo, the head of the board, began, his voice calm but firm, "we need to discuss your recent actions. Your personal life has started to impact the company's image. Your focus has shifted from the business, and we need to know how you intend to handle this situation." James took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had spent years building this empire, but now he had a new responsibility, a responsibility that could change everything. He had to make them understand. He had to make them see that his priorities had shifted. "I've made my decision," James said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Sophia is my daughter, and I will do whatever it takes to be the father she deserves. If that means stepping away from the company, so be it. I've spent my life chasing success, but I've realized that success means nothing without the people you love." The room was silent. Ricardo exchanged a glance with the other board members, his expression unreadable. James knew this wasn't going to be an easy conversation, but he was ready for whatever came next. "You're saying you're willing to walk away from everything you've built?" Ricardo asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Yes," James said firmly. "I will do whatever it takes to be there for Sophia. I can't change the past, but I can shape the future, and I choose to be her father." The room fell silent once more. James knew that this wasn't going to be easy, that there would be consequences, but he felt a sense of relief wash over him. For the first time in years, he had made a decision based on love, not money. He had chosen family over success, and it felt right. The meeting ended with no immediate resolution, but James felt a sense of peace. He had made his choice, and no matter what happened next, he knew it was the right one. As he walked out of the room, he felt lighter than he had in years. His empire, his wealth, it all seemed irrelevant now. All that mattered was Sophia, and he was going to fight for her, no matter what it took.